I never thought the people I loved most would one day plot my death. But the first time I tasted the bitter edge of poison in my evening tea, I knew this wasn't just my old age or my weak heart catching up with me. Someone close to me wanted me gone. My name is Margaret, I'm 72 years old, and until a year ago I thought I had lived a blessed life. I raised 2 children, watched my grandchildren take their first steps, and believed my husband had left me enough security after his passing to live out my days in peace. But that peace began to unravel the day my son Michael and his wife Claire moved into my home. They told me it was to take care of me, but from the very first week, I noticed the way Claire's eyes lingered a little too long on the safe in my study, the way Michael's voice hardened when he asked about my will. At first, I brushed it off. Families fight over silly things, don't they? Maybe it was just my imagination. But then little things began happening. My medication bottles were rearranged on the shelf. I would pour myself a glass of orange juice and feel suddenly dizzy, my chest tightening as though invisible hands were squeezing the air from my lungs. And each time I stumbled or gasped, Claire was right there, smiling politely, telling me it must be just age. One night, I overheard them. I had gone to bed early but couldn't sleep. As I walked quietly down the hall, I heard Claire's whisper, "She's weaker now. A few more weeks, maybe less. Once the lawyer confirms we're the beneficiaries, it'll be done." My heart stopped. Beneficiaries. My death. My own son sat silently beside her. He didn't object. He didn't defend me. He just muttered, "It has to look natural. No hospital. No questions." I went back to my room trembling. I wanted to call someone, anyone, but fear froze me. What if I was wrong? What if no one believed me? The idea of sounding paranoid haunted me, especially since Claire had been hinting to neighbors that my memory was slipping, planting seeds, little lies. And I realized they were setting me up. If I accused them, people would say it was my dementia talking. But I don't have dementia. My mind is sharp. My body may betray me, but my mind is clear. I started keeping a diary. Each strange symptom, each cruel whisper, every shift of medication. I wrote it down. I needed proof, even if only for myself. But evidence was hard to gather without raising suspicion. So I played along. I smiled at Claire, thanked her for her help, and acted every bit the fragile old woman she wanted me to be. Inside, though, I was screaming. One Sunday afternoon, after church, I returned home to find my safe open. My late husband's watch, gone. Several important documents, missing. When I asked Michael about it, he laughed. "Mom, you probably misplaced them." My son, my own flesh and blood, laughed in my face while standing next to the woman I was beginning to believe was poisoning me. That night, I felt sicker than ever before. My heart raced so violently I thought it might burst, and I collapsed on the floor. Claire walked in, phone in hand, and instead of dialing 911, she crouched beside me and whispered, "Sign the papers tomorrow, Margaret. It'll make everything easier." Her cold smile hovered above me as my vision blurred. My son wasn't home. He'd gone with the children to a movie. She had me all to herself, but fate wasn't on her side. The next morning, I woke up weak but alive. I should have been grateful, but instead I felt a rising fury. They thought I was disposable. They thought I was too frail to fight back. They thought I wouldn't notice my life being stolen piece by piece. They were wrong. And as I stared at the photo of my late husband on the nightstand, I promised him and myself that I would expose them. I didn't know how yet, but I would. Even if it killed me in the process, I wasn't going to die quietly. The following week, I asked my neighbor, Janet, to join me for tea. I trusted her. We'd known each other for decades. As we sat on the porch, I told her in hushed tones that something terrible was happening in my house. I showed her my diary, the missing documents, the whispered threats I had overheard. Her eyes widened, but she didn't call me crazy. She leaned in and said, "Margaret, you need real evidence, recordings, something undeniable." Her words ignited a spark. That night, while Michael and Claire argued downstairs, I placed an old voice recorder in the kitchen drawer. I didn't know what I would capture, but I prayed it would be enough to prove I wasn't losing my mind. Hours later, when they thought I was asleep, I heard it. Michael's voice, low and angry. "If she doesn't sign this week, Claire, we'll have to speed it up. I'm not waiting another month." My own son. And that's when I knew this wasn't just about inheritance. This was about survival. I couldn't sleep that night. The sound of my son's voice replayed in my head like a curse. "We'll have to speed it up." Those words cut through me worse than any illness could. My child, the boy I carried in my arms, the boy I sacrificed for, was now plotting my death with his wife. The betrayal sat heavy in my chest, and yet I forced myself to remain calm. Panic wouldn't save me. Proof would. The next morning I retrieved the recorder and tucked it deep into my pocket. My hands trembled as I listened to the playback in the privacy of my room. The evidence was clear. Michael and Claire conspiring, planning, waiting for me to sign something. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I knew if I went to the police with only this, they might dismiss me as a paranoid old woman. Claire had already planted that narrative in everyone's mind. So I needed more, something undeniable. That day, Claire served me soup for lunch. She insisted I eat it all, watching me with those calculating eyes. I forced myself to smile and take a few sips before excusing myself. Instead of finishing it, I poured the rest into a sealed jar I had hidden in my bag. If my suspicions were right, I'd have it tested. My neighbor Janet knew a retired pharmacist. Perhaps he could help. I would ask her quietly when Claire wasn't hovering. But Claire was relentless. She followed me everywhere, reminding me of my forgetfulness, correcting me when I stumbled over words, even hiding my reading glasses to make me look incompetent. Michael, meanwhile, kept pressing me about my will. "Mom, you should finalize things now, while you're still aware," he said one evening, his tone dripping with false concern. Still aware. The words stung. I knew what they were doing, building a case that I was no longer capable of making decisions. If they could prove dementia, they wouldn't need me to sign anything. They could have me declared unfit and take everything. My estate, my home, even the small trust I had set aside for my grandchildren, it would all be theirs. I couldn't let that happen. So I played the part they expected. I let myself look frail, confused, even forgetful. But behind the mask, I was sharper than ever. At night, when the house was quiet, I searched their rooms. One evening, while Claire showered, I slipped into her bedside drawer. What I found made my blood run cold. A small brown vial with no label, half filled with a clear liquid. I snapped a photo with my phone and put it back exactly where it was. Later, I added the photo to my growing file of evidence. I also began leaving subtle traps. A misplaced pill, a watered-down bottle of wine, a missing page from the legal documents they tried to shove under my nose. Each time, I watched how they reacted. Michael's jaw tightening, Claire's eyes narrowing, whispers behind closed doors. My little games confirmed what I already knew: they were desperate. One rainy night, I caught them in the act. I had pretended to fall asleep in my chair, clutching a blanket as though I had dozed off watching television. Through half-closed eyes, I saw Claire carefully unscrewing the cap of my evening tea. Michael hovered beside her, whispering, "Not too much. If she collapses, we call it a heart attack." My heart thundered, but I remained still, breathing slow and shallow. When they left the room, I carefully poured the tea into another jar and replaced it with fresh tea from the pot. Later, I stored the jar beside the soup in my hidden stash. The next morning, I feigned illness, clutching my chest dramatically. Claire's lips curled in satisfaction as she rushed to my side. "Don't worry, Margaret," she whispered sweetly. "It'll be over soon." Michael stood behind her, his expression unreadable, though I caught a flicker of impatience. That same day, I managed to slip out of the house under the pretense of visiting church. Instead, I went straight to Janet's. She took one look at my pale face and pulled me inside. I showed her the jars, the vial photo, and the recording. Her hands shook as she listened. "Margaret," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "this isn't just greedy. This is attempted murder." Janet called her pharmacist friend, who agreed to test the samples discreetly. I prayed every second that he would find something, anything, to prove I wasn't imagining this. Days passed in agonizing silence until finally Janet came to me with the results. Both the soup and the tea contained traces of digitalis, a heart medication that, in high doses, can cause cardiac arrest. My hands trembled as I held the paper. Proof. Real, undeniable proof. But proof was dangerous. If Michael and Claire discovered what I had, my life would be over before the police could even act. I knew I had to move carefully, like a hunter stalking prey. So I began staging my weakness more deliberately. I pretended to grow more forgetful, leaving the stove on, calling Michael by the wrong name, even wandering into the garden at odd hours. Claire lapped it up, her smirk growing wider each day. "She's slipping fast," she told Michael one evening, not realizing my recorder was hidden under the couch cushion. "Soon she'll be completely incompetent. Then, the estate will be ours." But what Claire didn't know was that I wasn't just recording her words anymore. I had already contacted someone else, someone Michael never expected me to reach out to. A former colleague of my late husband's, a lawyer who owed us a favor. I sent him copies of the recordings, the test results, even the photos. He promised me he'd start building a case quietly. All I had to do was survive long enough for him to finish. And as I sat alone that night, clutching the folder of evidence hidden beneath my mattress, I realized survival was the only game left. Because Michael and Claire weren't slowing down, they were accelerating. And the way Claire looked at me across the dinner table that night, her eyes, sharp and cold, told me one thing. They were ready to finish what they started. The days that followed were some of the longest of my life. Every meal, every drink, every pill they offered felt like a potential weapon. I would sit at the dining table, forcing a trembling smile, while Claire's sharp eyes tracked every bite I took. Michael barely spoke to me anymore. His patience was gone. He wanted results, money, freedom from me. And I had never felt like more of a prisoner in my own home. But what they didn't know was that each silent meal, each staged fainting spell, was part of my own plan. My late husband's lawyer, his name was Richard, had been working in the background. He told me to keep collecting evidence, but under no circumstances should I confront them until he was ready. "Margaret," he warned, "if they sense you're onto them, they'll act rashly. Stay the course." So I stayed the course, even when it nearly broke me. One evening, I overheard something that chilled me to my bones. Michael and Claire were in the kitchen, voices low but urgent. "She's dragging this out," Michael said, frustration dripping from every word. "The lawyer keeps delaying the will reading. We need this done." Claire's response was even colder. "Then maybe she needs a little push. One final dose, enough to put her in the hospital. Doctors will chalk it up to old age, and once she's gone, everything transfers." I felt my knees weaken as I stood in the hallway. My own son didn't object. He didn't hesitate. He simply said, "Fine, tomorrow then." Tomorrow. I barely slept that night. I lay in bed, listening to the sound of the rain against the windows, and thought of my grandchildren, sweet little faces that didn't know their father was plotting to kill their grandmother. I thought of my husband, gone too soon, and how ashamed he would be to see what had become of his only son. And I thought of myself, of the quiet, timid woman I had been just weeks before. That woman was gone. If I didn't fight now, there would be no tomorrow for me. The next morning I moved quickly. I called Janet before breakfast, whispering into the phone. "It's happening today. They're going to try again." She told me to stay calm, that she and Richard were already preparing something. "Whatever you do," she said, "don't let them know you've caught on." So I went to the table as usual. Claire served me oatmeal, her smile too wide, her movements too careful. I stirred the spoon slowly, watching the steam rise, then pretended to take a bite. "Not hungry today," I murmured, pushing the bowl aside. Claire's face tightened, but she didn't argue. Instead, she set a glass of water in front of me. I just knew. When she turned her back, I poured the water into a napkin and tucked it into my pocket. Later, I'd give it to Janet's pharmacist friend. My hands shook, but my face remained calm. That afternoon, something unexpected happened. A detective knocked on the door. Detective Harris, an old, broad-shouldered man with a tired smile. He said he was following up on a, quote, concern raised by a third party. Claire looked confused at first, then furious when he asked to speak with me privately. Michael tried to object, but Harris's gaze was firm. "It won't take long." In the living room, I told him everything. About the recordings, the poisoned food, the staged dementia. I handed him copies of the files Richard had helped me organize. Harris listened quietly, scribbling notes, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he leaned forward and said, "Mrs. Walker, if what you're saying is true, we need to catch them in the act. Will you be willing to cooperate in a sting?" My heart pounded. A sting. The words felt dangerous, but also empowering. For the first time, I wasn't just the victim, I was part of the plan. I nodded slowly. "Yes," I whispered. "Whatever it takes." That night, the trap was set. Harris and another officer placed small cameras in the kitchen and dining room. They hid a wire under my blouse, so every word would be recorded. It was terrifying, knowing that the next few hours could decide my fate. But I felt something stronger than fear, a simmering anger, a determination to finally expose the people who had betrayed me. At dinner, Claire poured me a glass of wine. Michael watched closely as I lifted it to my lips. My hands trembled, but I took the tiniest sip, enough to keep up the charade. Then Claire leaned in, her voice low, her smile sharp. "Drink it all, Margaret. You'll sleep well tonight." I forced a weak laugh. "Oh, Claire," I said softly, "you've always been so good to me." What she didn't know was that every word, every movement was being captured. Later that night, after I had retreated to my room, Harris and his team retrieved the glasses and plates. They promised me results within hours. I lay awake, clutching my diary, praying this would finally be enough. But early the next morning, I woke to the sound of raised voices downstairs. Harris was back, this time with more officers. Claire was screaming, Michael shouting about false accusations. I crept to the stairs, my knees weak, and watched as they led both of them out in handcuffs. Claire's face was twisted with rage, Michael's pale with shock. And yet, even as I watched them go, I felt no relief. Because deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. There would be court hearings, trials, accusations. They would fight back, deny everything, maybe even try to drag my name through the mud. But for the first time, I felt ready. What I didn't know then was just how ugly it would get once the courtroom doors opened, when every secret, every betrayal, every poisoned lie would be dragged into the light for the world to see. The courthouse smelled faintly of dust and old wood polish, like the weight of decades of secrets clung to its walls. I sat at the plaintiff's table, my hands folded tightly in my lap, trying to steady the tremor in my fingers. Across from me, Claire and Michael sat beside their defense attorney, a slick-looking man in an expensive gray suit. Claire's eyes were hard, unflinching, as though daring me to look away first. Michael, though, looked broken, his shoulders hunched, his gaze fixed on the floor, as though he couldn't bear to meet my eyes. When the bailiff called the court to order, the air shifted. This was no longer about whispered suspicions in my home. This was a battle under oath, with every word recorded, every lie subject to cross-examination. The prosecutor, a sharp young woman named Ada Reynolds, rose to make her opening statement. Her voice was steady, commanding, but filled with a quiet anger that made my chest ache with recognition. "This is not a case of misunderstanding or confusion," she began, her gaze sweeping across the jury. "This is a case of calculated betrayal. A son and his wife, people entrusted with the care of an elderly mother, chose greed over love, deception over honesty, and murder over mercy." She laid out the roadmap of the case. The tampered food and drink, the staged dementia, the financial pressure. "You will hear evidence," she promised, that shows how the defendants planned, prepared, and attempted to poison Margaret Walker in order to seize control of her estate. I glanced at the jurors, watching their faces. Some frowned, others scribbled notes. They didn't know me yet, not really, but soon they would. When Reynolds sat down, the defense attorney, Mr. Blake, rose with a smooth smile. He wasted no time turning the tables. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, "what you are about to hear is not a story of crime. It is a story of family tension, of misunderstandings twisted into accusations, and of an aging woman's paranoia, exploited by outsiders with their own agendas." His words stung, but I forced myself to stay still. This was his strategy, to make me appear weak, confused, unreliable. "There is no poison," he declared, "no conspiracy, only a loving son and daughter-in-law vilified by false evidence." It was almost impressive, the ease with which he spoke lies. Almost. The first witness called was Dr. Carrington, my longtime physician. She took the stand with calm authority, explaining how traces of digitalis and potassium had been detected in my blood work. In combination, she explained, these substances could cause irregular heartbeat, dizziness, and ultimately cardiac arrest. In an elderly patient with existing heart concerns, death would have seemed entirely natural. Blake tried to discredit her. Isn't it possible, he asked, that these results were due to a laboratory error? Dr. Carrington didn't flinch. No, she said firmly. The tests were run multiple times. The substances were there. Next came Frank Doyle, the pharmacist who had raised suspicions months earlier. He testified about Claire's unusual questions regarding my prescriptions. She asked about interactions between specific drugs, he said, adjusting his glasses nervously. She seemed very interested in how certain combinations could weaken the heart. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. I sat taller, gripping the edge of my seat. Then came Detective Harris. His testimony was the turning point. He explained the sting operation, the cameras in the dining room, the wire I'd worn. He described how the glass of wine Claire had poured for me tested positive for toxic levels of sedatives. And then, the prosecutor played the recording. My voice, faint but steady. Oh, Claire, you've always been so good to me. Claire's voice, sharp and low. Drink it all, Margaret. You'll sleep well tonight. The jury gasped. One woman covered her mouth with her hand. For the first time, Claire's composure cracked. She shifted in her chair, eyes darting nervously toward Michael. Blake immediately objected, claiming the recording was, quote, taken out of context. But the damage was done. When court adjourned for the day, I stepped out into the crisp autumn air, my knees weak but my spirit strong. I had survived the first battle. But I also knew the defense hadn't played their strongest card yet. They would come for me directly, questioning my memory, my stability, my sanity. And if I faltered, even for a moment, it could undo everything. That night, alone in my bed, I whispered to myself like a vow. They took my trust. They tried to take my life. But they will not take my truth. I didn't know then just how brutal the next cross-examinations would become, or how much darker secrets would be dragged into the light before this trial was over. The next morning, I arrived at the courthouse with my heart pounding harder than it had in years. The gallery was fuller than before. Neighbors, acquaintances, even strangers drawn by the spectacle of a family tearing itself apart under oath. Reporters scribbled in their notepads, cameras clicked outside the courtroom doors. It felt less like a trial and more like a stage, with my life as the showpiece. As I settled into my seat at the plaintiff's table, ADA Reynolds leaned close and whispered, "They'll try to rattle you. Stay calm. Answer only what's asked. And remember, you have the truth." The bailiff called the court to order, and Judge Hargrave, a stern woman with steel-gray hair, entered. "Bring in the witness," she instructed. My name was called. I rose slowly, walked to the stand, and raised my hand to take the oath. The wooden chair creaked as I sat, and suddenly every eye in the room was fixed on me. Reynolds began gently. "Mrs. Walker, can you tell the jury, in your own words, when you first suspected something was wrong?" My throat felt dry, but my voice carried steady. I told them about the dizziness, the blackouts, the strange aftertaste in my drinks. I described finding the altered pill bottles and the way Claire would insist I'd imagine things. "Did you confront your son?" Reynolds asked. "Yes," I said, my chest tightening. He told me I was confused, that I needed more rest. But I knew. A mother always knows when something isn't right. There was a murmur in the courtroom. I continued, step by step, reliving the moments I had doubted my own mind, and then the relief of finding allies. The pharmacist, Dr. Carrington, Detective Harris. When Reynolds finished, she gave me a reassuring nod and sat. Then Blake rose. The room seemed to cool a degree. He approached with that same silk smile, holding his pen like a blade. "Mrs. Walker," he said smoothly, "you've lived a long and full life, haven't you?" "Yes." "And at your age, isn't it fair to say that memory can sometimes play tricks?" A low hum rippled through the gallery. I straightened. "My memory is clear enough to remember who tried to poison me." Gasps. Blake's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before returning. Of course. But stress can cloud judgment. You've admitted to dizziness, confusion, even blackouts. How can you be certain those weren't symptoms of natural aging rather than foul play? I took a breath, steadying my voice, because the doctors found poison in my blood, and because I heard Claire's own voice telling me to drink. He paced slowly, then stopped, eyes narrowing. Or, perhaps, Mrs. Walker, you misheard. Perhaps you mistook concern for cruelty. Isn't it possible you're twisting things, influenced by others who planted fear in your mind? I locked eyes with him. The only people planting anything were the ones trying to bury me. There was an audible gasp from the jury box. Even Judge Hargrave's brow lifted slightly before she tapped her gavel for order. Blake's face tightened. He turned sharply. No further questions. But he wasn't finished, not by a long shot. That afternoon, the defense called Michael to the stand. My son. My own flesh and blood. He walked slowly, his head lowered, but when he took the oath and sat, Blake guided him with careful questions. Michael, Blake began, did you ever want to harm your mother? No, Michael said quickly, his voice thick with emotion. Never. I love her. She raised me alone after my father died. Everything I've done has been for her. Blake nodded solemnly. Then how do you explain these accusations? Michael glanced at me, his eyes brimming. She's been forgetful, confused. I thought she was getting worse. Claire and I only wanted to help. His words were knives, cutting into me. Yet I also saw the tremor in his hands, the guilt etched into his face. Reynolds rose for cross-examination. Michael, she said evenly, if you loved your mother so much, why did you allow your wife to handle her medications without oversight? He swallowed hard. Claire wanted to help. And did you know she asked pharmacists about dangerous drug combinations? He hesitated. No, I didn't. Then why? Reynolds pressed. Did we find text messages on your phone discussing how much longer your mother might hold out and whether the will could be expedited? The jury leaned forward as Michael's face drained of color. I didn't mean, he stammered. Answer the question, Reynolds demanded. Michael's voice broke. I was angry. We were struggling with money. I didn't mean I never wanted her dead. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Blake objected furiously, but the damage was done. I sat frozen, watching my son unravel on the stand, torn between heartbreak and grim vindication. When court recessed for the day, I walked past him. He reached out as if to touch my arm, but I pulled away. His voice cracked in a whisper only I could hear. Mom, I'm sorry. But apologies wouldn't save him now. The real storm was still coming. The moment Claire herself would take the stand. And if Michael had cracked this easily, I could only imagine how far she would go to protect herself. And what new truths might be dragged into the open when she did. The air inside the courtroom on the third morning felt heavier than before. Even the wood paneling seemed darker, the ceiling lower. Everyone knew what was coming, Claire's turn on the stand. She swept in with that same air of superiority, a designer dress hugging her frame, her chin tilted just enough to feign poise. But I noticed the stiffness in her step, the faint twitch of her fingers clutching her purse. She was afraid, even if she'd never admit it. The clerk swore her in. She sat, crossing her legs carefully, and turned to face the jury with what she must have thought was her warmest smile. Blake approached smoothly. Mrs. Walker, thank you for being here. Would you please tell the jury a little about yourself and your relationship with your mother-in-law? Claire folded her hands like a saint in a painting. Of course. I have always respected her. She's been through so much, and I wanted to be there for her. She was confused sometimes. Forgetful. I tried my best to keep her comfortable. Her voice was honey, her tone soft, but I could see through it. Every word was an act, a performance to mask the venom beneath. And the medications? Blake asked. Why were you involved? She sighed delicately. Because Michael worked long hours. Someone had to take responsibility. I thought I was helping, but somehow, I became the villain. She dabbed her eyes with a tissue, though not a single tear fell. Blake nodded sympathetically, then turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, Does this sound like a would-be murderer to you? Or like a woman unfairly accused, caught in a storm of confusion? The jurors shifted, some skeptical, others uncertain. Blake was good, too good. But then it was Reynolds' turn. She stood slowly, her eyes sharp, her voice steady. Mrs. Walker, you claim you only wanted to help, is that correct? Yes, Claire answered sweetly. Then can you explain why you asked 2 separate pharmacists if a particular mixture of drugs could be fatal? Claire's smile faltered just slightly. I don't recall that. Reynolds lifted a folder. Perhaps this will help your memory. These are written statements from both pharmacists, signed and notarized. They describe you by name and appearance. One even noted your exact words. Would this make an elderly woman sleep and never wake up? Gasps filled the room. Claire's composure cracked for the first time. That's not what I meant, she stammered. It was hypothetical, just curiosity. Reynolds cut her off. Hypothetical about how to kill your husband's mother? The jury leaned forward, eyes locked on Claire. She tried to regain footing, her voice rising. No! I loved her. She misunderstood me. Everyone misunderstood me. Reynolds took a step closer, lowering her tone. Then why did detectives find your fingerprints on the altered pill bottles in Mrs. Walker's kitchen? The silence was deafening. Claire's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time, she looked cornered, trapped. But Reynolds wasn't finished. She signaled to the bailiff, who wheeled in a television cart. The screen flickered on, and there it was, the recording. Claire's voice, cold and unmistakable. Drink this. It'll help you sleep. No one will question it when you're gone. The courtroom erupted. Jurors exchanged horrified glances. Whispers raced through the gallery. Even Blake froze, his pen slipping from his hand. Claire lunged forward, shouting, "That's taken out of context. She set me up. This is all a trick." Judge Hargraves slammed her gavel. "Order! Mrs. Walker, control yourself." But it was too late. The mask had shattered. The jury had heard her true voice, dripping with malice. Reynolds leaned in one final time. "No further questions, Your Honor?" Claire sat trembling, her face pale, her composure in ruins. The woman who had walked in, poised and polished, now looked like exactly what she was, a predator caught in the light. As she was led back to the defense table, Michael refused to meet her eyes. For the first time, I saw distance between them, a crack in their united front. Judge Hargrave announced, "Closing arguments will begin tomorrow. Jury will deliberate thereafter." The gavel struck, ending the day's session. As I stood to leave, I glanced back at Claire. Her eyes found mine, burning with hatred. She mouthed something across the room. "This isn't over." A chill ran down my spine, but I knew, deep down, it was. The evidence was there. The jury had seen through the lies, and tomorrow I would finally hear justice spoken aloud. The next morning, the courthouse seemed alive with tension. Reporters clustered outside, their microphones angled toward anyone who looked remotely connected to the case. The scent of coffee and rain hung in the air as I made my way past them, my knees trembling with anticipation. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with nervous energy. The jurors looked weary but alert. They knew today mattered more than any other. Michael sat rigid at the defense table, his jaw clenched, his eyes darting between the judge and his wife. Claire's once polished aura had eroded completely. Her hair looked unkempt, her makeup smudged. She barely looked like the same woman who had walked in days ago with her chin held high. Judge Hargrave's gavel struck. "We will now hear closing arguments. Counselors, proceed." Blake rose first, smoothing his tie, trying to regain control of the narrative. He paced slowly before the jury, his voice calm but urgent. "Ladies and gentlemen, I ask you to consider the facts carefully. My clients, Michael and Claire, may not be perfect. They may have made mistakes, but mistakes are not crimes. Mrs. Walker, Margaret, admits herself she was under stress, confused, vulnerable. Memories can be flawed, recordings can be doctored, and witnesses? Witnesses can be mistaken. Do you truly believe," he said, his eyes sweeping across the jury, "that a daughter-in-law who cooked meals and drove to appointments would suddenly plot such a monstrous act? That a son would betray his own mother for money? The prosecution wants you to see villains. But what if this is just a tragic misunderstanding, fueled by paranoia and resentment? He let the words hang, his expression grave. Do not destroy 2 lives based on fear. Return a verdict of not guilty. He sat down, his lips pressed thin. Then Reynolds stood. Her presence filled the room without effort. She didn't pace, didn't raise her voice at first. She simply looked each juror in the eye, one by one. You have heard the words from their own mouths. Not mine. Theirs. She gestured toward Claire. The recording. The pharmacists. The fingerprints. These are not the inventions of paranoia. They are facts. Facts that scream intent. Her tone sharpened. Mrs. Walker wasn't confused. She was nearly silenced. Michael didn't stumble into bad decisions. He orchestrated them, hoping greed would outweigh conscience. They called her forgetful, unstable, a burden. And why? Because her home, her inheritance, her life itself, stood in their way. Reynolds took a slow step closer to the jury box. This is not about misunderstandings. This is about betrayal, cold and deliberate. A betrayal of trust, of family, of love. And if they could do this to their own mother, what does that tell you about the danger they pose to anyone else? She paused, letting silence fill the room. Then her voice dropped, fierce and certain. Justice demands a guilty verdict. The words hung like thunder. Judge Hargrave turned to the jury. You have heard the arguments. The jury will now deliberate. Bailiffs escort them to the deliberation room. The jurors filed out, solemn, their faces unreadable. The heavy door closed behind them with a metallic thud, and the waiting began. Time stretched painfully. Hours passed. I sat rigid on the wooden bench, my hands folded tightly in my lap. Each tick of the clock felt like a drumbeat inside my skull. Michael whispered furiously with Blake. Claire sat still, staring at the tabletop, her lips moving soundlessly, as if in prayer or curse. Every so often, the bailiff entered with a note, requests for transcripts, pieces of evidence to review again. Each time, my stomach clenched tighter. What if they doubted? What if Blake had planted just enough uncertainty? By evening, the tension was unbearable. A murmur spread across the room as the bailiff reappeared, this time carrying a folded slip of paper. He handed it to Judge Hargrave. The judge's expression didn't change as she read, but my heart stopped beating for a moment. She cleared her throat. The jury has reached a verdict. Gasps echoed around the courtroom. My chest tightened. This was it. The moment everything hinged on. The jurors filed back in, their faces drawn, grave. The foreperson clutched a small sheet of paper. Judge Hargrave's voice was steady. Madam Foreperson, has the jury reached a unanimous verdict? The woman stood. We have, Your Honor. The judge nodded. Please hand the verdict to the bailiff. The slip was passed, handed to the clerk, then to the judge. She read it silently, her face unreadable, before returning it to the clerk. The clerk's voice rang out, cutting through the silence. In the case of the people versus Michael Walker and Claire Walker, on the charge of attempted murder, the courtroom held its breath. We, the jury, find the defendants. The words that followed would decide everything. The air in the courtroom felt like glass about to shatter. Every breath, every heartbeat, seemed to echo too loudly. The clerk unfolded the slip of paper with steady hands, though his voice trembled slightly as he read. In the case of the people versus Michael Walker and Claire Walker, on the charge of attempted murder, we, the jury, find the defendants guilty. For a moment, silence consumed everything. No one moved. No one breathed. Then the words sank in. Claire gasped as though struck, her hand flying to her mouth. Michael's jaw dropped, his eyes darting desperately to the jury, as if one of them might stand up and say it was a mistake. But they all sat firm, their faces solemn, united. The gallery erupted. Some cried out in relief, others in shock. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens scratching like thunder. Claire shrieked, "No! No, this isn't right! They twisted everything! You don't understand! I was trying to help her!" She lunged at the defense table, knocking over a glass of water, her voice piercing the air. Judge Hargrave banged her gavel. "Order in the court! Order!" Two bailiffs rushed to restrain Claire as she writhed in their grip, her polished facade completely obliterated. Her screams turned raw, animalistic. "You ruined me! All of you! She set me up!" Her eyes locked on mine across the room, blazing with venom. "You'll pay for this, Margaret!" A shiver slid down my spine, but I sat taller. For the first time in years, I felt no fear. Only vindication. Michael slumped in his chair, silent. He didn't fight, didn't shout. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. He simply stared at the floor, as though the weight of the verdict had crushed every last ounce of defiance from him. Judge Hargrave's voice cut through the chaos. "The jury has spoken. Sentencing will be scheduled in 72 hours. The defendants will be remanded into custody until that time." The bailiffs cuffed Claire and Michael. Claire struggled, thrashing like a trapped animal, but Michael didn't resist. He allowed the chains to be fastened around his wrists, his head hanging low. As they were led out, Claire's voice echoed through the chamber. "This isn't over. You'll regret this, all of you." The doors slammed shut behind them, leaving a lingering silence in their wake. I exhaled slowly, realizing I had been holding my breath. My hands trembled, but not from fear, from release. For so long I had lived under their shadow, doubting my mind, questioning my sanity. Now, the truth had been spoken aloud for the world to hear. Reynolds touched my shoulder gently. "It's done. Justice is on your side now." But deep inside, I knew it wasn't truly done yet. There was still sentencing. There were still the consequences to unravel, the pieces of my life to reassemble, and I had to face the reality of what my own son had tried to do to me. As I left the courtroom, flashes from cameras blinded me. Voices shouted questions. "How do you feel? Do you forgive them? What will you do now?" I didn't answer. My heart was too heavy, my throat too tight. I simply walked forward, past the reporters, past the chaos, into the crisp evening air. The sky was streaked with orange and purple as the sun dipped low, and for the first time in years, I felt the weight on my chest begin to lift. But I also knew the hardest part was yet to come. Because when blood betrays blood, victory never feels clean. 3 days later, I stood once again inside the same courtroom. Yet this time, the air was different. The trial was over. The verdict had been delivered. Now came the final act, the sentencing. The benches were filled to the brim. Reporters, neighbors, even strangers who had followed the case, crowded into the gallery. Everyone wanted to witness the fate of the couple who had nearly taken my life. Claire entered first, shackled at the wrists and ankles, her once perfect blonde hair a disheveled mess. The glow she carried when this all began had vanished. Her skin looked gray, her eyes feral and desperate. She scanned the room, her gaze darting until it landed on me. A bitter smile twisted her lips, but it carried no power anymore. Michael shuffled in behind her, shoulders slumped, avoiding every gaze. He looked smaller somehow, diminished, like a man who had aged decades in a few short days. He did not glance my way, and for that, I was grateful. Judge Hargrave called the session to order. Her voice carried the weight of finality. "This court reconvenes for sentencing in the matter of the People versus Michael Walker and Claire Walker. The defendants have been found guilty on charges of attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, elder abuse, and financial fraud. Today we hear final statements before sentencing." The prosecution went first. Adia Keller rose, her tone measured but unyielding. "Your Honor, the evidence has already shown the chilling calculation behind these crimes. Mrs. Walker and her son did not act in haste or passion. They plotted. They manipulated. They slowly poisoned the victim while fabricating a narrative of dementia, to strip her of her dignity and her independence. Such acts are not merely criminal, they are cruel at their core. The state requests the maximum penalty allowed under law. To do less would send a dangerous message that elder abuse, attempted murder, and financial predation can be minimized. Justice must be firm. Every word was a hammer blow, and I nodded silently as she spoke. Then the defense rose. Their tone was softer, almost pleading. Your Honor, while the jury has rendered its verdict, we ask the court to remember that Michael Walker has no prior criminal record. He was manipulated by his wife, drawn into her schemes through misplaced loyalty and emotional coercion. We ask for mercy in his sentencing. As for Claire Walker, we acknowledge the seriousness of the charges, but ask for consideration of her role as a mother to a young child. Removing her for the rest of her natural life would also punish an innocent daughter. We ask this court to impose a sentence that recognizes remorse and the possibility of rehabilitation. Remorse? I glanced at Claire. Her eyes burned with hatred, her lips pressed tight, her jaw trembling. If there was remorse in her, I could not see it. Then came the part one dreaded and anticipated in equal measure. The judge turned to me. Mrs. Ellsworth, would you like to make a victim impact statement? My legs trembled as I rose, but my voice was steady when I spoke. Your Honor, I will never forget the nights I lay awake, wondering if I was losing my mind, wondering if the pills I took were making me sicker, or if my fears were just the ramblings of an aging woman. My own son, my flesh and blood, looked me in the eyes and told me I was imagining things, while the woman I welcomed into my home poisoned me inch by inch. They stole my dignity before they even tried to steal my life. My voice caught, but I pressed on, eyes fixed on Michael. A mother's greatest gift is trust, and my son shattered mine. That betrayal will scar me longer than any poison ever could. Then I turned to Claire. She met my gaze with defiance. You underestimated me. You saw only an old woman to be eliminated, not a survivor. You thought you could write my ending. But I write my own story. And today, I ask this court to write yours, with the full weight of justice. Because you don't deserve freedom. You don't deserve the chance to do this to anyone else. When I sat down, the room was utterly silent. Even the reporters had stopped writing. Judge Hargrave folded her hands, her face grave. This court has heard the evidence, the pleas, and the impact. These crimes strike at the heart of family, trust, and human decency. They were deliberate, sustained, and cruel. She turned first to Claire. Claire Walker, for your role as the architect of this conspiracy, for the manipulation, the poisoning, the deceit, you are hereby sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 30 years. Claire screamed, her knees buckling. The bailiffs held her upright as she shouted, You can't do this to me! I'm not a monster! The judge ignored her. She turned to Michael. Michael Walker, though your role was lesser, you stood by, complicit, and allowed your wife's cruelty to unfold unchecked. For that, this court sentences you to 25 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after 15. Michael bowed his head, tears spilling down his cheeks. I'm sorry, Mom, he whispered, his voice breaking. But it was far too late. The gavel came down, sealing their fates, and in that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Freedom. When the gavel struck and the bailiffs led Claire and Michael away, I thought I would feel only triumph. And yes, there was triumph in me, but there was also grief. Grief for the son I had raised, the boy I once cradled against my chest, who had now become a man led out of the courtroom in shackles. Neighbors came to hug me after the sentencing. Reporters asked for comments. The prosecutor squeezed my hand and whispered, You were the strongest witness I've ever seen. But inside, I felt hollow. Justice had been done, but justice doesn't stitch up the heart so easily. In the weeks that followed, life was both quieter and louder. Quieter because the constant fear was gone. Louder because my phone rang endlessly. Relatives checking on me, journalists requesting interviews, even advocacy groups for elder justice inviting me to speak. I declined most. I didn't want to become a public figure. I just wanted to be me again. Anna Ellsworth, grandmother, gardener, lover of quiet mornings. Yet I couldn't deny the change inside me. I wasn't the same woman who had once doubted her own mind while swallowing poisoned pills. I was sharper now, more cautious, but also braver. When you've stared betrayal in the face and survived, you stop fearing smaller things. Claire's sentencing made headlines. The tabloids called her the poisoning daughter-in-law. Michael's name appeared too, but always second, almost as if his role had already faded into the background. I learned that he was being held at a medium security facility upstate. Claire, however, was sent to a maximum security prison for women. One night, weeks later, I received a letter. The handwriting was familiar. It was Michael's. My hands trembled as I opened it. "Mom, I don't expect forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it. I don't know why I went along with Claire. Maybe I was weak. Maybe I was afraid of losing her. Maybe I thought somehow it wouldn't go that far. I see now what a coward I was. I see the pain I caused you. Not a day will pass in here that I won't think of that. I don't know if you'll ever want to see me again, but if you ever do, I'll be waiting. I love you. Michael." I read the letter 3 times. I cried until the ink smudged. I folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer. Someday, maybe, I would decide what to do with it. As for Claire, she didn't write. She never would. She had only venom in her veins, and prison would not wash it out. Reports from the papers said she spent her first weeks trying to manipulate other inmates, but prison is a place where predators eat their own. I almost pitied her, but not quite. Life slowly returned to a rhythm. My health improved dramatically once I stopped taking the tainted pills. My doctor said my body was recovering well, though some damage might linger. I didn't mind. I was alive. I had beaten the odds. One sunny afternoon, I sat in my garden with my granddaughter, Lily. She was only 10, but wise beyond her years. She looked up at me with those wide, curious eyes and asked, "Grandma, why did they hurt you?" I paused, searching for words. Finally, I said, "Because sometimes people let greed take over their hearts. They forget love, they forget family. But do you know what matters most, Lily?" She tilted her head. "What?" "That even when people hurt you, you stay strong, you fight back, and you never, ever let someone else write the ending to your story." She nodded solemnly, then hugged me tight. In that embrace, I felt hope. Hope that the cycle would not repeat, that her generation would learn from mine. Months later, I stood at a podium, not in a courtroom this time, but at a community center. I had agreed to speak at an elder justice awareness event. As I looked out at the audience of mostly women my age, I saw in their eyes the same fear I had once carried. Fear of being dismissed, of being silenced, of being betrayed by those closest to them. I told them my story, every painful detail. And when I finished, I said, "If you ever feel like your truth is being buried, dig deeper. If you feel like you're being made to doubt your mind, hold on tighter to it. And if you feel alone, remember, you are not. There are people who will listen, and you deserve to be heard." The room erupted in applause. For the first time in a long time, I didn't just feel like a survivor. I felt like a voice. As I left that night, a woman stopped me at the door. She whispered, "Your story saved me. I think my daughter is doing the same to me. Now I know I need to act." Her words stayed with me. Maybe this was my purpose now. Not just surviving, but helping others do the same. And yet, as much as I wanted to close the chapter, one thought lingered. Michael's letter, sitting in that drawer, waiting. Could I forgive him? Should I forgive him? That question still keeps me awake some nights. But perhaps that's life. Justice doesn't tie everything neatly with a bow. Some wounds never heal fully. Some doors stay half open. I only know this. I lived. I fought. I reclaimed my voice. And as long as I breathe, no one will ever silence me again.